With mandatory minicamp just around the corner next week, competitions on all three sides of the football are going to heat up for the Seahawks. Which competitions are we looking forward to the most as we get closer to the 2024 season? We'll be breaking it all down on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined as always here on this fine Tuesday by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in nearby Port Townsend, Washington, or over in Wheeling, West Virginia. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Mandatory minicamp coming up next week for the Seahawks. They should have most, if not all, of their players at least in attendance for that 3-day minicamp, which means competitions are going to be heating up. Rob and I are going to be ranking our top 5 positional battles to watch as we draw closer to the 2024 season. We're going to look at the free agent scrap heap and a few players that might make some sense for the Seahawks to sign before training camp. And as we do every offseason going into a new year, 90-man countdown time. We got our first 3 players. We'll be diving in on some interesting undrafted free agents for the Seahawks. It's a jam-packed episode brought your way by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. OTAs are not quite finished for the Seahawks. They've still got 3 of them left this week. None of them are open to the media, though. And you figure the Seahawks are going to start winding things down a little bit because next week is when things start to really get interesting. Mandatory minicamp. Basically, it's the same setup, no contact, things of that nature. It's still not real football. And yet, Rob, this is going to be required for veterans to show up. So some players that we haven't seen up to this point are going to be back in town. Whether they practice or not remains to be seen. But this will be a crucial 3 days. And normally this is where positional competitions really start to heat up because you're going to have most, if not all, your players on the field. You haven't been able to say that during OTAs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I think that this is a really timely topic here, just because of the fact that as you said, the mini camps are going to begin. They are mandatory. And so we saw Leonard Williams, grace the Seahawks with his presence in during yesterday's media allowed session of the OTAs. But we haven't seen Draymond Jones. We haven't seen DK Metcalf or some of Seattle's other big superstars. So I think that this is a perfect time for us to really kind of talk about what are some of the training camp just the positional battles that we hope to get a little bit more clarity over this mandatory mini camp coming up, as well as training camp. And I'll just jump right into that conversation. Going to kind of work our way down, starting at number 5 overall. And then that's one of the ones that I'm concerned about, but not as quite as much as I am the very last one that I'll be mentioning. So kind of going in descending order here, number 5 overall, Corbin, we talked so much about the kick return position. And right now it looks like it's going to be a combination of Laviska Shenault and perhaps D. Eskridge. Maybe it's going to be a guy like a D. Williams, a free agent, or somebody like that who might be able to jump in there. But I really think that the kick return specialist is going to be something that bears watching. Jay Harbaugh, the new special teams coach, kind of talked about how giddy he was with just the excitement of possibly being able to see some real wrinkles at that position and just the kick return units in general. I am fascinated to see who is going to wind up toting the rock, so to speak, for the Seahawks deep on kick returns with DJ Dallas, now a member of the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I've got kick return specialist as number 5 on my list because I think in normal situations, last few years, this wouldn't have even been in consideration. But with these new rules that are going to emphasize kicking the ball to opponents and allowing them to return the football, I think that you are going to see a lot more importance back there with who you put back returning kicks. And there's some creativity to it. Jay Harbaugh clearly was excited about it. And the other reason I have it here is I really think the last receiver spot or maybe even the last 2 receiver spots could depend on how this plays out with the kick return position. So you could really put those 2 spots together. For me, though, I decided to go special teams. At number 4, I've got to have running backs in this list because I know Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet, that is clearly your number 1, number 2 battering ram in the backfield. But Kenny McIntosh didn't play any offensive snaps last year. You've got George Halani, the undrafted rookie out of Boise State, who looks to be the most talented undrafted player they brought in. But you got a couple other undrafted running backs there that could be in the mix that are going to be competing to replace DJ Dallas, as you mentioned. And so I think that third down back spot, some special teams value there as well. We can see that at the bottom of this ranking here, but I've got the third down back position coming in at number 4 for me and kick return at number 5. I think those are both going to be really interesting battles that maybe aren't going to be talked about as much because it's not offensive line, it's not defensive line, things of that nature, but still, these are really important positional battles that I feel like there's going to be a wide open competition to see who wins those jobs.
Yeah, exactly. Wide open competition. You basically took the words right out of my mouth, Corbin. I don't think this is just about the third down back. I think this is about who's getting the opportunities initially. I think Ken Walker III clearly has demonstrated better big play potential, at least in his 2 seasons, of course, with the Seahawks, as opposed to Zach Charbonnet in his 1 season a year ago. But still, I think that you could make a strong argument that Zach Charbonnet deserves to get at least as many opportunities as Ken Walker III because he has proven to be a little bit more consistent and maybe has more of that kind of bell cow mentality, especially between the tackles, that if Seattle wants to become as big and physical as they claim, that maybe that should be part of this battle here. But I 100% agree with you. Third down back is definitely going to be a positional battle to keep an eye on. I think that you articulated it well between Kenny McIntosh and, of course, George Halani being the favorites at that point. But I still believe that just the number 1 and number 2 reps at the running back position are going to be something that bears watching as well. And then finally, where things are going to really change between you and I have right tackle as a huge position of concern for this club. Clearly, if Abraham Lucas is back and healthy, then that's his job. But I don't think that we can just assume that that is the case. The fact that he has been unable or unwilling to participate to this point, he is expected to be back for training camp. At least that's what the Seahawks have stated. But it's George Fant, it's Stone Forsythe. The Seahawks have to figure out what they're going to do at that right tackle position.
Yeah, they really do. And I think the other thing that you have to consider there, and I didn't put right tackle on my list just because I look at the depth that Seattle has there, and it feels like George Fant is going to be the guy if Abraham Lucas is not going to be starting. Stone Forsythe has shown that he can start. He had 8 starts last year. I don't know that there's going to be a battle for any pecking order stuff there, even if Abraham Lucas is not there. Now, Mike Jarrell, Garrett Greenfield, they could throw their hats in the ring. So it was a group that I considered, but I couldn't put him in my top 5 just because even without Abraham Lucas, it does feel like there's a clear pecking order there with George Fant, George Fant and Stone Forsythe being the next 2 tackles on there. But where you and I are in agreement, I've got the third cornerback role at number 3. I'm just fascinated to see Mike Jackson against Trey Brown on the outside. Those 2 guys are going to be competing because we know Devin Witherspoon's going to play a lot in the slot. It really boils down to, is Brown the better fit for this scheme for Mike McDonald, or is it going to be Mike Jackson? So I'm going to be watching that. Where you and I are in agreement, we both have inside linebacker near the top of the pecking order here, as it should be. And this would be a position that would be near the top of my list, even without the injuries. But we don't know if Jerome Baker is going to be ready to go for the start of training camp. Tyrell Dodson's still very limited. Radigan and Patrick O'Connell getting the first team reps right now. You've got a rookie in Tyrese Knight that's still trying to get his feet wet on the second team, next to an undrafted rookie in Easton Gibbs. I mean, there are just a lot of question marks there. And I feel like this could go a number of ways. I think Seattle wants Dodson and Baker to be the guys in week 1, but injuries are something to consider here. And Tyrese Knight is a player that seems to be picking some things up quickly. He might get his chance to play with the ones eventually. So for me, inside linebacker coming in at number 2 and right guard at number 1, just because Anthony Bradford versus Christian Haynes, and maybe throw McLennan Curtis in there at this point. You could have a 3-horse race that is wide open for who's going to start in week 1, and that is a crucial position on the offensive line for the Seahawks to get figured out. So inside linebacker, right guard, I think you could mix and match these 2. I'm going with right guard at number 1, though, because I just think it's going to be the most enticing competition with as many as 3 players trying to duke it out to win that starting job.
Yeah, and I think you make a strong argument for that. I can't really argue. I had him flip-flopped. I had right guard as the number 2 positional battle that I am most eagerly looking forward to, and then inside linebacker as the top positional battle. For the right guard position, I think that it's critical. At the same time, I also just acknowledging history. The Seahawks have had basically a revolving door at the guard positions now for years. Yep. So we're just kind of used to that, unfortunately. And I do believe that the Seahawks have some quality options there. Look, I think that they are hoping that that Christian Haynes is going to seize this job as the rookie and basically is going to just carve his way into Seahawk immortality. At the same time, I also feel confident the Seahawks have a quality starter in Anthony Bradford already. And McClendon Curtis, of course, as we've talked about before, he's the guy getting the starting reps so far throughout these mandatory mini camps, the voluntary OTAs that we've had to this point. And he has been name dropped a couple of times by John Schneider unprompted. So clearly, McClendon Curtis from UT Chattanooga is getting some positive reviews from the Seahawks. That is, to me, very, very different than what we're seeing at the inside linebacker position, where Tyrell Dodson, despite the fact that he was rated highly by Pro Football Focus and other analytic websites, he did not generate a great deal of interest on the free agent market. Jerome Baker, of course, is coming off of the injuries. Both of them obviously are replacements for what the Seahawks lost with Bobby Wagner and Jordan Brooks. And then you have all these rookies. You mentioned Easton Gibbs and, obviously Tyrese Knight. And you've got some solid veterans, I suppose, at least what you've seen in practice in John Radigan and Patrick O'Connell. But, of course, we've not seen either of them playing significant NFL snaps. To me, this is the positional group that bears watching, not only because it is the position of my personal greatest concern, but also it's the position of Mike McDonald that supposedly has, his greatest strength. And so similar to the skepticism that I think a lot of Seahawks fans may have felt when Pete Carroll was trying out some 5th-round former wide receiver named Richard Sherman at cornerback, the audacity of trying that. I want to see Mike McDonald work his genius with this linebacker crew to make sure the Seahawks are going to be physical enough to actually contend for postseason success this year.
When we come back, we're seeing some teams start to make late free agent signings. The Seahawks don't have a ton of cap space to work with, but who are a few veterans that would make sense for Seattle to bring on board before training camp? Rob and I are going to be looking at one player on offense and one player on defense apiece when we come back here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. You shouldn't have to rip your hair out when you buy tickets to your next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They offer killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and with their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Back in April, my wife and I got awesome seats in the lower bowl to see the Colorado Avalanche and the Winnipeg Jets in a playoff game for under $120 a piece. Colorado ended up getting the 5-1 victory. We had a blast and didn't pay an arm and a leg for awesome seats between playoff teams. Game Time has deals on tickets right at the day of the event, and the Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price to write your own memories. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Game Time will offer you 110% credit of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download a Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are now in early June. At this stage, you don't see a lot of players getting signed. Free agency, it's been weeks since it was active at all. You're seeing a few occasional signings out there. The 49ers did add Logan Thomas, who's had a pretty good career as a tight end in Washington. just what Seahawks want to hear. Another good tight end potentially going to the San Francisco 49ers. But nonetheless, those are the kind of moves that we're seeing. Teams bringing in veterans as they head towards training camp here. And Seattle does not have a lot of cap space to work with right now. But, Rob, looking at the free agent scrap heap, the guys that are still out there available that maybe could have a chance to be contributors in Seattle, I want to start on offense. Who is a player that jumps out to you that's still available that, at least from a competition standpoint, would make sense for the Seahawks to bring in on a buy low, potentially high dividend contract?
Well, to me, again, as I talked about before, I am concerned about the right tackle position. So focusing on offense first, I really tried to look at the tackles that are available. And there's a lot of guys that are above 30 years old that I think could be able to come in and perhaps even push for starting play. At the same time, we know how John Schneider has operated in the past. He is not typically going to go with somebody north of 30. So I focused in on a player who's 26 years old, was a former early round selection. Well, I should say a former early round hyped prospect. He wound up actually falling a little bit later undrafted than expected. But that's Prince Tega Wanogho from previously the Kansas City Chiefs. He's only 26 years old. He's got starting experience against dominant SEC competition, of course, playing at Auburn. At the Kansas City Chiefs, I've been fortunate enough to go to Kansas City the last couple of years over the summer during my duties with the BC Lions. And the Chiefs, the fact that they've won the past couple of Super Bowls, obviously they're a very talented team. Andy Reid is head coach, former offensive line coach there. They've done an incredible job of turning out NFL prospects. And so I really think that, again, this tackle position is something that the Seahawks are going to need to kind of consider. And I do think that Prince Tega Wanogho has the upside as well as the experience that the Seahawks might prioritize.
I looked at the offensive line, Rob, because obviously you never can have too many, quality bodies in the trenches, especially when you have a number of starting jobs that are up for grabs. But I guess I am more confident in George Fant and Stone Forsythe that they have to hold things down while Abraham Lucas is working his way back from knee surgery. And so I looked at the tackle position, didn't see anybody that really jumped out. And this is not because I'm a running back guy. It's just we mentioned this a few moments ago. You've got Kenny McIntosh with 0 regular season offensive snaps to his name. You've got George Halani, a rookie out of Boise State. Obviously, has never played an NFL snap. You have a couple undrafted guys. That third down role still could be one where bringing a veteran in makes sense. And so I'm going to bring in a guy that the Seahawks know quite well from his time with the San Francisco 49ers, and that's Matt Breida. Now, he averaged under 3 yards per carry with the Giants last season. It was his worst professional year as a runner. But if you look at his track record, he is a guy that has been able to come in as a third down back, and he's been able to provide some juice out of the backfield as a runner. And oh, by the way, he's got almost 200 career catches in his career with 3 or 4 teams. So this is a guy that has soft hands in the backfield. He has some route running ability. He has been a decent pass protector in his career. This is a guy that really carved out a great NFL career for an undrafted player coming into the NFL. So Matt Breida is a guy that I think would make a lot of sense if you're wanting to bolster your competition there with Kenny McIntosh, George Halani, any of these other undrafted running backs. Matt Breida is a guy that can come in day one and he can immediately give you some valuable third down reps. And there's some special teams ability too. He might be somebody to look at kick returns with this new setup because, as I've mentioned, it's kind of like run plays now with these new rules. Matt Breida is somebody that has kick return experience anyway that could make sense there. So I'm looking at more of a gadget running back that could make some sense to bring in. Now on defense, I think you and I are probably thinking of the same tangent here, and it kind of goes with what we mentioned last segment with the biggest roster positional battles, and one of them being inside linebacker, whereas there's so many questions there that's really where it creates that hype for watching it as a competition. But there are some veteran linebackers that are still out there. It feels like a lot of the other position groups, there's not a lot available. I did consider J-Ron Curse at safety because of his background with Adam Durde, and he's played a lot of snaps, a big guy that can play in the box. But I think you and I are probably thinking on the same spectrum here with linebackers.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as you just said, like with Jaron Kearse, I mean, I consider the safety position. I mean, there's a couple of former Seahawks safeties, Quandre Diggs, Jamal Adams. They're still kind of laying out there in the weeds, and knowing the way that Mike McDonald has interchanged his safeties in Baltimore, that is something to consider. He's an all-pro with Justin Simmons, who's still out there as well. So, again, there's some really good football players out there, but there are also a lot of guys who are, again, a little bit older or longer in the tooth, I guess I should say, and have some medical questions about them. And so the linebacker that I'm going to talk about here, Blake Martinez, is somebody that was incredibly productive for his first 3-4 years in the NFL. In the last 3 or 4 years, he basically has barely even played. And so that suggests to me that the game is kind of passing by. Maybe he's slowed down a little bit. Maybe he's hampered a little bit. Look, I'm not going to yell and scream and try to push the Seahawks to sign a Blake Martinez, but I do believe that if healthy, he is one of the few linebackers who is available that has the instincts and the physicality to be able to come in and contribute meaningful snaps immediately. Whereas I mentioned before, Prince Tega Wanago, the offensive lineman, this is not a guy who started a lot in the NFL. I still think that there is some untapped potential with him. And you mentioned the special teams element there to kind of wrap up with, say, Matt Breida. I think Prince Tega Wanago could be one of those offensive linemen who basically can be a versatile blocker on kick returns as well. This is a guy who ran the 4.7s at 300 pounds. So, again, that is a dynamic athlete that I think would be really intriguing. You're not going to have that same conversation with Blake Martinez, but he will stomp people in the hole. And again, that is to me one of the biggest areas of concern I have for this club is, do they have the traditional run stuffing linebacker to be able to kind of live up to all this bravado that the Seahawks have claimed here? So Blake Martinez, linebacker, he's just turned 30 years old, so he is a little bit older than I'd like. And again, the production hasn't been there the last couple of years. But if the Seahawks do have any concerns at the linebacker position, I think that Martinez would be somebody that's at least worth kicking the tires.
Yeah, and I think Shaq Leonard, it's a very similar situation. Although you go back and you watch the way he played against teams with the Eagles last year after he joined Philadelphia, played in 5 regular season games. The production was hit and miss. There was some rough tape in coverage, but this is a guy that's still only 28 going on 29. He's 2 years removed from being a first-team All-Pro. There's been a bunch of injuries there. But watching the way he was moving in those games, I still see the athlete that the Colts had his first 4 years in the NFL. He's still a young player he's at least a fairly young player that's got a lot of experience under his belt. And I think that his strengths, if he's playing what he's capable of playing at, or at least at this point in his career, I think that he's a guy that you can plug into Mike McDonald's defense that can do a lot of the things that you're looking for. And so that would truly be hey, we're taking a flyer on you. We're going to give you a 1-year deal, veteran minimum with some incentives on it. Go out and show that you can still play. And if things work out, then you could have a guy that could be a full-time starter for you that can play at a really high level. And if not, hey, you took your chance. Now move forward to the other guys that you have. But there's nothing wrong with going that route. And the other good thing with him, I don't know if the Seahawks have Pokemon cards in their locker room, but if they do, the good news is that I don't think Shaq Leonard, you'd have to worry anything about that. Whereas Blake Martinez, well, that remains to be seen. But anyway, I think both those players, at least as those buy low, potentially high dividend veteran signings, could make some sense for the Seahawks. When we come back, we're going to kick off our 90-man countdown as we do each and every year, numbers 90 through 88. We got a trio undrafted rookies to kick things off. We're going to be diving in to all 3 of those players, talking best and worst case scenarios, where they fit in with the Seahawks, and much more. Don't go away. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. It is now championship time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in $50, win or lose. Will Brianna Stewart scorch the Nets with 20 or more points for the New York Liberty against the Chicago Sky? Does red-hot Jose Ramirez have another home run in store for the Guardians against the Royals? Or will it be Yordan Alvarez hitting moonshots for the Astros against the Cardinals? You can bet on it all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 Sportsbook. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for your everyday needs, including the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is an exciting time here on Locked On Seahawks. It is officially time to start our 90-man countdown. We take a deep dive into all 90 players in Seattle's roster, and the schedule is set up, Rob, for us to unleash our final two players the day before training camp starts with this schedule. So we're going to look at number 90 through 88 here, and we're going to kick off with a couple of players that signed with the Seahawks after auditioning in rookie minicamp. Coming in at number 90, he looks fairly similar to Byron Murphy from a physical standpoint when you see him on the field with his number 62 jersey. Buda Jones coming out of Troy. He was one of those audition players trying out at rookie minicamp that impressed enough that the Seahawks gave him a contract. And now he's going to be trying to compete in what looks to be a pretty deep nose tackle position for the Seahawks this summer.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an uphill climb for Buda Jones to be able to make this roster. But at the same time, when you look at, he was a more productive player at Troy than his statistics suggest. He was a disruptive guy, and he was a disruptive guy early on in the OTAs. That's why he got signed. And then the Seahawks brought him in. He doesn't have the great arm length and power that you are hoping for, but he's got quick, violent hands, and he seems to locate the football. He's got kind of a knack for splitting gaps and being able to at least create some initial penetration, disruption in the pocket that forces the opposing quarterback or running back to have to adjust, and hopefully, from a Seahawks perspective, into the waiting arms of a teammate. 6'1", 307 pounds, short, stubby build. As you said, I mean, he looks a lot like Byron Murphy. He's got this really thick thighs and lower half, but he's got significantly shorter arms and does get himself blocked out of the play a little bit too often to suggest that he is likely to be able to make this team outright. I view his best case scenario as being able to kind of work his way throughout this OTA process, throughout training camp, get himself into the games, in the preseason games. And that's where I think he might be able to make a splashy play or two. I do think that he is, of the three players that we're going to be talking about here today, Corbin, I think that Buda Jones probably has the best chance of actually making Seattle's practice squad.
Yeah, I think from a practice squad standpoint that this is clearly the best case scenario for me, unless there's injuries, and we know this is the NFL, things happen. The Seahawks clearly value his skill set. The thing I like on the tape I've watched at Troy, that thick lower body that you were referencing, he does hold up well against double teams. This is a guy that holds serve, and he's able to split gaps, and he just plays with really good technique in those situations too. So in a 3-4 hybrid defense, that is going to be something that's going to be a big deal when you're playing that nose tackle position. But I view him as a developmental player that you can try to get some extra work with on the practice squad if he's impressive enough in the preseason. The issues that you still got, though, is think of all the players that Seattle has now that can play nose tackle. You've got Jonathan Hankins. You've got Cameron Young. Byron Murphy can easily play nose tackle with that thick lower body and just the physicality, the heavy hands that he's got. Jared Reed can play in there. Heck, Miles Adams has got some good reps in the NFL playing nose tackle. So this is going to be an uphill climb for him. I think best case scenario is getting the practice squad, but there's a strong possibility with a guy that was a late add-in like this that, especially given the fact it does sound like he's nursing an injury right now too, that is a player that can't afford to miss practice reps right now if you're trying to keep your name on the radar for a roster spot. So it's going to be tough climbing. Now, our next player, number 89, there's going to be some local flavor here, even though he only played one season at Washington State and previously was at New Mexico State as well as Texas. Devin Richardson, the athletic linebacker coming from the Cougs, had his best year last year as an all-around defender at Washington State, up and down production in his college career. But Rob, this is a player that when you look at the athletic testing, didn't have great straight line speed, but had really good change of direction numbers. You can see that on the field. There's some good clips in coverage as well. The key for Devin Richardson in this wide open linebacker group, like a lot of players he's competing against, if you can stand out on special teams, especially the new kick coverage, if you can be a player that can stand out in that regard, maybe, just maybe, you can stick around for a little bit and maybe even push for a 53-man roster spot.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that he does have a chance because of special teams specifically, and the fact that, as you just pointed out, at the defensive tackle and nose guard position, it's just such an uphill climb, just because Seattle has truly vested veterans ahead of him, whereas that's not the case at the linebacker spot, as we talked about just a couple of moments ago. I mean, even the guys that were brought in and had success elsewhere, obviously, are brand new at Seattle. So there is no allegiance to them whatsoever. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting about Richardson. He is kind of the exact opposite of Buda Jones. He's long and he's very quick. He's very agile, as you just kind of talked about. He's 6'2", he's 230 pounds. Special teams is where I really think that he could make a mark for the Seahawks, because he is not a particularly physical player at the point of attack. He's kind of the different type of a linebacker than what Seattle seems to be prioritizing in terms of a traditional 3-4 defense, where your linebackers are mostly, at least the inside linebacker spot, those kind of run stuffers. This guy is at his best in coverage, but as we talked about earlier in the show, the 49ers just brought in a tight end and Logan Thomas. And of course, we know that the 49ers, the Rams, and the Cardinals, as well as all the other NFL clubs out there, they've got such a variety of pass catchers now that you have to have linebackers who can cover. Richardson can do that. So he's an interesting guy that if he shows enough on special teams, then I do think that he's got a chance to perhaps make this roster, or at least, again, be a candidate for the practice squad.
Yeah, the physicality against the run, that's the big X factor here, because you don't see that consistently on his college tape at any of the three schools he played at, but he can run to the football. There's some coverage traits there. So special teams is going to be huge. Our last guy here on our first segment here for our 90-man countdown, we talked undrafted running backs a little bit today. We're going to go to a player that we haven't talked about much at this point, because it's really been mostly about George Holani, but I think we'd be remiss not to mention Tamarick Williams, who actually started his career as a 3-star recruit that committed to SMU. So he was playing in an FBS program, a non-Power 5, but still SMU has had some really good NFL players come out of there in recent years. Williams couldn't carve out a role there, so he transferred after a couple years, went to North Dakota State, which has become a pretty good running back factory over the years. They had a number of guys that have been drafted, and this guy's interesting in the sense, Rob, that he's 217 pounds. He's got some battering ram to him in his game, and he was never the feature back at North Dakota State, and yet he averaged over 7 yards per carry last year for the Bison. This guy kind of runs like a bison that's got wheels. Like, he knows how to truck guys. He generated a lot of yards after contact. So from that standpoint, Seattle wants physicality. Maybe this is a guy, if he plays well in the preseason, that can stick around. My concern goes to the fact that when you watch his college tape at SMU and North Dakota State, there's very little evidence of him being a pass catcher, and his pass protection, just to be honest, Rob, his pass protection was atrocious most of the time at North Dakota State. You aren't making an NFL roster if you can't do those two things.
Yeah, but I do think that those are coachable aspects. As you said, I mean, he's a back that's 220 pounds, and he runs like it. He runs through his pads and looks for contact. It was funny. I was talking to some scouts after the draft when Seattle signed this young man, Tamarick Williams, out of North Dakota State, and I asked for a comparison, and one of the comps I got was a poor man's Chris Carson. Now, obviously, if the Seahawks are able to find another version of Chris Carson, they would be ecstatic. But Chris Carson came into the NFL, of course, after bouncing around a couple of different clubs, after not possessing the ball skills that you were looking for as far as a receiver. And he wound up working his way into being a very productive pass catcher and a reliable pass blocker. So I do have some hope for Tamarick Williams that he can develop that area. And I do like that he is a little bit more of a Zach Charbonnet clone. Again, we talked about earlier in today's show that the Seahawks might be looking to have a little bit more of that black and blue kind of a mentality of really punching people in the mouth rather than trying to elude them and run away from them, the way that Kenneth Walker III has done such a spectacular job over his career. So I am intrigued by Tamarick Williams. I feel like he's one of the players that we haven't talked about enough, Corbin. And of course, one of the realities of this time of year is that just like linebackers aren't asked to make tackles, defensive backs are asked to really break up passes. They're allowing the skill position players to make their plays. We haven't seen running backs be able to bounce off of contact when defensive players are really trying to make those tackles. So we haven't seen Tamarick Williams at his best, in my opinion. So I'm really excited to see what he is able to do when we get into the really physical battles of training camp and obviously the preseason games, to see if his ability to bounce off of contact continues in the NFL the way that it did at North Dakota State specifically.
I've already highlighted his name for guys that I'm excited to watch when the pads come out, because this is a player that his value, I think, is going to be demonstrated a lot more once the real football starts. Maybe he's this year's Troy Maine Pope and he's running through guys in the preseason and he runs his way onto the roster, and the physical tools are there for him to be a pass catcher and good in pass protection. As you said, those are coachable things, but just didn't get a lot of opportunities in the pass protection film. The fundamentals there need to be coached up. If he responds to that under Kennedy Polamalu, though, maybe, just maybe, Tamarick Williams gives George Halani a run for his money as the undrafted rookie that makes this football team in that third or fourth running back spot. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Reg. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to have a really fun guest joining the show. Make sure that you are listening in as we dive into some intel behind the Seahawks pre-draft and draft process. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.